for my next lecture. Gets it up where I can read. From chapter 7, leading in from that last number, the title's called War is Unwinnable. It starts off, America's most infamous war is the one we call civil. After its brutal conclusion, General William Tecumseh Sherman told the citizens of the United Republic in a speech to school kids that war is all hell. The chronology of American history is usually depicted as a sequence of these hellacious episodes, just as the history of the biosphere is revealed by the fossil record. We trace our cultural inheritance by narratives of combat that interrupt periods of peace. Now, many narratives we use to explain our world are overly simplistic and therefore fundamentally flawed, and competition is one of them. We love the story that populations compete to the death, as in warfare, with the stronger one wiping out the weaker. Yet, as we've seen in this book, with populations as diverse as pipe-dwelling bacteria and the Iroquois people of North America, this simply isn't true. Populations are rarely eradicated. Instead, they assimilate in some way with the larger population, or find a niche in which they can retain many of their traits and continue their way of life in an equilibrium of coexistence. Human wars, even though we try to justify them with ideology, are comparable to natural population phenomena. The European settlers of the New World frontier and the American Indians were acting in a way that would be familiar to any evolutionary biologist or natural historian. They came into conflict as natural resources became increasingly limited. Their home ranges expanded, and after much bloodshed and fighting, eventually found a functional equilibrium that allowed the populations to coexist. Now, this might not be considered functional from the Indian perspective, but granted, all these populations were significantly changed by the conflict, and none of them was completely eradicated by it. The story of early American history is not one of conquerors and vanquished people, it's one of evolutionary transformation. That is to say, from both a biological and a cultural perspective, assimilation of our species is evident. This assessment says nothing about the mistreatment of American Indians or the displacement of them, all of which should be viewed with compassion and sympathy. What we should take from it, however, is that the biased view of a more advanced culture outcompeting or rubbing out a lesser one is not tenable. The understanding of assimilation requires a worldview that favors ongoing symbiosis over a definitive battle for existence. But that in itself is not enough. Another component is necessary, the environmental influence on the commingling populations. Such a perspective leads us to reconsider radically how we can coexist with other populations and other species. To do so, we'll have to accept that many of the ideologies that we live by are flawed, and then replace them with more functional ones that allow us to engage with the populations that surround us while we try to alter the environment of our coexistence. Now, the idea of competitive struggle in populations began as a narrative device by Thomas Robert Malthus in 1798 to describe poverty and wealth in an increasingly industrialized society. His essay on the principle of population in 1798 treated food as a prize of sorts. His postulate was simple. As human numbers increase at an exponential rate, food production cannot keep pace, and therefore a struggle for existence results among all individuals. Food, according to Malthus, is the primary limited resource, and famine is a natural impediment to population growth. The human population, if left unchecked, would grow according to the exponential law of increase, while food can only increase at a much slower arithmetic rate. Famine was, to Malthus, an obvious limiting factor in the happiness and health of the human population, but it was also a constant threat to population growth. The more work expended in fighting off starvation, the less time and energy is spent on reproduction. The theoretical framework of his essay is straightforward enough, and it makes perfect sense. However, it was only the starting point for a much broader political polemic against the idea of charity for the poor. Malthus's essay was criticized for 3 decades after its publication, yet competition remained out of the spotlight. Instead, critics focused on things like future improvement. They couldn't understand how an increase in population could be viewed as a threat to humankind. Intellectuals of the early 19th century believed that population growth must be a sign of prosperity, not limitation or danger. They were blind, perhaps, to the broad causes of poverty. And of course, the ones doing the writing in those days were of the privileged classes, trying to avoid responsibility for taking care of unemployed workers. Despite its criticism, the gist of Malthus's essay has come to be often repeated, and an often repeated explanation for why some people have so little while others have so much. Competition is hardened into a seldom questioned truism, ignoring historical factors or the constraints imparted by socioeconomics. Most people today believe that the workforce is seen as a competition in which the winners get rewarded and the losers deserve their low status. In this oversimplistic view of things, poor people have no reason to claim unfairness because the competitive struggle is not rigged. Each member of society is in the same competitive arena, and the feast or famine rules are the same for rich and poor alike. If you lose too many games, you'll sink progressively lower on the ladder of success. Those at the bottom are simply not trying hard enough, and they should be able to wrest themselves out of poverty if they would simply try harder. Perhaps work more hours or try some other job that's better suited to their abilities. Now, obviously, I don't agree with that, and that 19th century reasoning, as I said, hardened mostly because of one man, Charles Darwin. Darwin read Malthus's essay around 1838, and after spending many years thinking about an explanation for the diverse adaptations that he saw of plants and animals, he came up with Malthusian reasonings. Seeing the spoils of competition as favorable variations, Darwin used this reasoning to suggest that under the conditions of a population's struggle for existence, the favorable variations would tend to be preserved, while unfavorable ones would quickly die out. The basic Darwinian doctrine. The continuation of this process through multiple generations, according to Darwin, would lead to new species. Natural selection would pick the most profitable. Because of the inherent properties of population increase and the scarcity of resources, even a slight variation in a trait that enhances survival and reproduction can be considered a win for the competitors. Now, Darwin's fame came roughly 20 years later after the publication of Origin of Species, his most popular book. The popularity of his controversial book, which stated simply that natural law rather than natural theology was responsible for what we see in nature. The initial printing of 1,200 books sold out only 2 days after their release, and the second printing of 3,000 books sold out the next month, and it's never been out of print since. It was Darwin's idea rather than his personality or actions that drove his renown. While it's well known that the idea of natural selection originated with insights from Malthus, less well known is the fact that Darwin helped to make Malthus famous in return. As Darwin's natural selection became the primary mechanism for explaining evolution through the 20th century, Malthus's ideas about competition came along with it. Today we have political and economic theory being formed by what happens in nature, and biology being informed by economics. This tradition isn't new. It can be traced back to Darwin's time, when political economists began to adopt Darwinian ideas into their teaching. But the point here is that the tradition of using ideas from nature and applying them to economics and vice versa is an old one. Sometimes entrenched intellectual traditions like this operate without anyone challenging the logical necessity of their operation. Competition is such an important explanatory concept that a crack in its foundation might bring down the entire edifice of modern economics, political science, and modern biology all at once. The most popular narratives from all these fields have transcended the ivory tower and taken root among millions of readers of award-winning books such as Freakonomics, The Selfish Gene, or Civilization, The West and the Rest. All these books depend heavily on the idea that competition drives everything forward in an unending natural progression. Without competition, there's no progress. Without competition, there's no continuity of the intellectual tradition that links nature to socioeconomics. So it goes relatively unchallenged. But there is a challenge that has been waged in the last 30 years. The The biologist Lynn Margulis, now deceased, and her endosymbiotic theory ushered in a challenge to the popular view that everything is explainable as selfish genes and natural selection. She emphasized the ubiquity of symbiosis and pointed to the fact that all familiar organisms are in fact amalgamations of genomes from different organisms. This implies a biosphere of interconnected populations and networks of organisms rather than one of constant warfare and self-interested individuals. What are the roles of competition and natural selection in this view? Well, clearly the role of competition in this neo-Darwinian view of natural selection, acting on individuals for the benefit of the genes they carry, has to be de-emphasized. In the alternative view of Lynn Margulis, natural selection is reframed as a measure of ecosystem efficiency. The biosphere itself is a selector, not of individuals, but of more efficient or less efficient communities. This web of interdependence gives us a reason to make decisions that are good for the environment and gives us a justification for taking care of our cohorts. In short, it takes the emphasis off short-sighted, selfish objectives that come from the belief in competition. In such a worldview, we can restore competition to its rightful place, a defined contest for an agreed-upon goal, rather than the driving force behind all human conflict, prosperity, and misfortune. But also we can see evolution in a more positive light, not as a brutal war of competing individuals, but as a product of symbiotic relationships. The biosphere that we depend on also depends on us, and this realization provides the impetus to act as caretakers, not only of other people, species, and ecosystems, but also of each other. In order to achieve any of this, however, we first have to come to terms with what we can and what we cannot control. Thank you.
Thank you.